The Smokescreen. Chapter 1. The Empire of Ash. James Jim Albright sat behind the wide mahogany desk in his expansive corner office, gazing out at the city below. Albright Tobacco Corporation, once a modest family business, had grown into one of the largest cigarette companies in the country under his leadership. The sprawling headquarters towered above the metropolis like a monument to his success, and Jim, now in his late 40s, was the man who made it happen. Years of corporate battles, marketing schemes, and a tenacity for exploiting loopholes had elevated him to this position. It was a business he inherited from his father, but it was Jim who had redefined it. Albright Tobacco had become a juggernaut, and Jim's personal wealth had skyrocketed into the hundreds of millions. The prestige, power, and money he amassed were the envy of every rival. Yet for Jim, something was missing. He glanced at the clock. It was just after 7 p.m. He hadn't left the office yet, and neither had she. His secretary, Clara Hendricks. For 3 years, she had been at his side, managing his schedule, organizing his meetings, and even taking on personal tasks he never entrusted to anyone else. Clara was different from the rest of the corporate machinery that whirred and buzzed around Jim's office. She was young, only 28, and despite the professional attire she always wore, her beauty had a way of pulling at Jim's attention. It started innocently enough. Long hours spent together, an occasional drink after work, and eventually flirtation. As weeks turned into months, their conversations blurred, becoming more personal, intimate, and dangerous. Jim was a married man. His wife, Elizabeth, was the picture of class and devotion. They had met during college and had built a life together over 2 decades. She was elegant and sophisticated, the type of woman who could host charity galas or corporate dinners with equal grace. She had given him 2 children, now teenagers. To the outside world, their life was perfect. But to Jim, it had become a routine, a suffocating pattern of obligations and expectations. Clara, on the other hand, offered something different. There was a thrill, an energy, in their affair that rekindled Jim's sense of virility. He felt alive in her presence, in a way he hadn't for years. He knew it was wrong, that it threatened everything he had worked so hard to build, but he couldn't stop. The flame that had been sparked between them months ago had now grown into a secret inferno, one Jim was not sure he wanted to extinguish. That night, as Jim prepared to leave the office, Clara appeared at his door. "Late night?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes betraying something more. "Yeah," Jim muttered. "These meetings keep piling up." His eyes followed her as she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. She walked over to his desk, not as an employee, but as someone who held power of a different sort. "Do you need help with anything else?" she asked, her voice lower now, as she stood at the edge of his desk. Jim's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't the first time Clara had stayed late with him, alone, but there was something in the air tonight, something charged. Without saying a word, Jim stood up, walked around the desk, and met her eyes. What followed was inevitable. A kiss that turned into something far more intimate, something that blurred the line between professional and personal. Chapter 2. The Smokescreen Cracks. Weeks passed, and Jim found it harder to compartmentalize the different parts of his life. His affair with Clara was no longer a secret he could easily push to the side. She was now part of his thoughts constantly, and their late-night encounters were becoming more frequent, more dangerous. They weren't just risking their reputations, they were risking everything. The guilt gnawed at him, especially when he was home with Elizabeth. His wife remained blissfully unaware of the deception. At least, that's what Jim told himself. Elizabeth still smiled at him as if nothing had changed, still planned family vacations, and still asked him how work was going. But Jim knew he had grown distant. He avoided her questions, buried himself in work, and distanced himself emotionally, all while telling himself it was temporary. Until the day Clara called him into her office with news that sent his world spinning. "I'm pregnant." Those 2 words hung in the air like a thick cloud of smoke, choking the oxygen from the room. Jim stared at Clara, his mind racing to process the implications. "Are you sure?" he asked, knowing full well that it was a foolish question. Clara nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I took 2 tests. I'm sure." The weight of it hit Jim like a freight train. He couldn't remember feeling so powerless, so cornered. All his life he had been in control of his business, his image, his family. Now with just 2 words, Clara had shattered the illusion of control he'd worked so hard to maintain. "What are we going to do?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. She had been composed up until now, but the gravity of the situation was clearly beginning to take its toll. Jim sat down, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. He had worked too hard to build his empire, to craft his perfect life, for it all to come crumbling down over an affair. "I don't know," he whispered, rubbing his face. "I have no idea." Chapter 3. A Web of Deception. Jim's initial shock gave way to panic. He had to figure out a plan, something, anything to fix this. Clara had hinted that she wasn't sure what to do about the pregnancy, but she left the decision hanging in the air, waiting for Jim to take the lead. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and stress. At home, Jim acted as if nothing had changed, forcing smiles and engaging in shallow conversations with Elizabeth. She seemed none the wiser, but the guilt was eating him alive. He started to think she might notice the shift, how he couldn't meet her eyes, how he seemed to lose himself in thought during family dinners. Meanwhile, Clara's condition was becoming harder to ignore. She hadn't mentioned it again after that initial conversation, but Jim could feel the tension between them every time they spoke. He knew the clock was ticking. They couldn't keep this secret forever. He finally suggested to Clara that they meet outside the office to discuss it in private. They agreed on a quiet cafe in a neighboring town, far enough away from anyone who might recognize them. As they sat across from each other at the dimly lit table, Clara seemed nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "So," Clara began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what to do. I haven't made any decisions yet, but I wanted to know where you stand." Jim swallowed, his throat dry. He knew what she was asking, but he wasn't sure how to answer. "I can't just, Clara, my family. My wife. This could destroy everything," he stammered. Clara nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know. But I didn't do this alone, Jim. We both made this mess." He couldn't argue with that. The reality was inescapable. They had both been reckless, both let the boundaries blur. Now they were trapped in a situation where no solution seemed good enough. "Do you want to keep it?" Jim finally asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Clara didn't answer right away. She glanced up at him, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should, but I know what that means for us." Jim felt the world closing in around him. If Clara decided to keep the baby, his life would implode. The media would have a field day with the scandal. A powerful tobacco executive, married with children, having an affair with his secretary. His career, his reputation, and his family would all be ruined. But even as his mind raced through the consequences, another part of him felt something unexpected. A pang of guilt over asking Clara to give up her child for his own sake. I'll support whatever decision you make," Jim finally said, the words feeling hollow in his mouth. He didn't know if he meant them, but it was all he could manage. Clara nodded, her face unreadable. "Thank you, Jim. I'll let you know what I decide." They parted ways, but Jim's mind remained clouded with worry. The future had never seemed so uncertain. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into chaos. Clara eventually decided to keep the baby, a decision that made Jim's chest tighten with dread. He didn't know how to navigate the situation. Every day felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, waiting for it all to come crashing down. At home, Elizabeth began to notice the change in Jim's behavior. She wasn't stupid, she had seen him distracted before, usually during times of high-pressure work, but this was different. He was distant, cold even, and no longer made any effort to hide it. Something had shifted in their relationship, and Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just stress from the office. One night, after a tense family dinner, Elizabeth confronted him. "Jim, what's going on with you?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with concern. Jim, sitting in his study, glanced up from the papers he was pretending to read. He forced a smile, but Elizabeth wasn't buying it. "You've been different. Distant. I can tell something's wrong," she pressed. Jim swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been good at lying to Elizabeth, she knew him too well. But he couldn't tell her the truth, not now, not when everything was so precariously balanced. "It's just work," he said finally, keeping his voice steady. "Things are crazy right now with the new regulations coming down from Washington. I've just been under a lot of pressure." Elizabeth studied him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. She seemed unconvinced, but she didn't push further. Instead, she gave a small nod and left the room, leaving Jim alone with his guilt. Chapter 5: The Collapse. As Clara's pregnancy advanced, it became increasingly difficult to keep the secret hidden. She had taken a leave of absence from work, citing personal reasons, but rumors were beginning to spread through the office. Jim tried to maintain control, but the walls were closing in. The real breaking point came when Elizabeth found out. It happened by chance. Elizabeth had come to the office to surprise Jim with lunch, something she hadn't done in years. She had wanted to rekindle some of the romance that had faded over the years, to remind him that she still cared, still loved him. But when she arrived, she overheard a conversation between two employees in the hallway. "Did you hear about Clara? I heard she's pregnant. And it's Jim's kid." Elizabeth froze in her tracks, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her hands shook as she set the lunch down and quickly left the building, tears stinging her eyes. She drove home in a daze, her mind racing through all the little signs she had ignored. All the late nights, all the coldness. It had all been right in front of her, and she had missed it. When Jim arrived home that evening, Elizabeth was waiting for him. She stood in the living room, her arms crossed, her face pale. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jim stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. He knew immediately what she was asking. He had been dreading this moment for months, but now it was here, and there was no escaping it. "Elizabeth, he began, but she cut him off. "Is it true, Jim? Is she pregnant with your child?" Jim couldn't meet her eyes. He felt like the world was crumbling beneath him. All the lies, all the deceit had finally caught up with him. "Yes," he whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. Elizabeth stood still, her face a mask of shock and pain. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. "I trusted you," she said, her voice trembling. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Jim tried to explain, tried to tell her that it had been a mistake, that he never meant for it to go this far, but the words felt empty. There was nothing he could say that would make it right. "I want you out," Elizabeth said finally, her voice cold and firm. "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce." The word hit Jim like a physical blow. He had expected anger, maybe even screaming, but the finality of her statement shook him to his core. "Elizabeth, please," he pleaded, but she shook her head. "It's too late, Jim. You've already destroyed us." Chapter 6: Ashes to Ashes. Jim left the house that night, his heart heavy with regret. He had lost everything: his wife, his family, his reputation. The scandal broke soon after, hitting the tabloids like wildfire. Albright Tobacco's stock plummeted as the media seized on the affair, painting Jim as the villain in a sordid drama of greed, betrayal, and deception. Clara gave birth to a baby boy, but Jim's relationship with her was strained. The affair had been built on a foundation of lies and guilt, and now, with the truth out in the open, it crumbled. Jim tried to be a father to the child, but his heart wasn't in it. The guilt of what he had done to his family overshadowed everything else. Elizabeth moved forward with the divorce, and Jim found himself living alone in a small apartment, far from the luxurious life he had once known. His empire, built on ash and deception, had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the smoke that still lingered in the air, a reminder of the life he had destroyed. In the end, Jim Albright was left with nothing but the ashes of his former life, a man consumed by his own mistakes, watching as the empire he had built went up in smoke.